This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to use the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription.
It's been a while since we discussed the upcoming French elections, but as we explained previously, incumbent Macron has long been the bookies' favourite. Just a few weeks ago, modelling by The Economist gave Macron an 80% chance of winning a second term, something no incumbent French president has achieved in 20 years. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at how the war in Ukraine has affected the French presidential election, and whether it's helped or hindered Macron. Before we get into the video, a quick disclaimer. We're conscious that talking about the interaction between the war in Ukraine and electoral politics can look a bit grotesque. There's a sense in which it feels inappropriate to be talking about French electoral politics when there are thousands of people being killed and displaced in Ukraine. Nonetheless, whilst it may pale in comparison to the war in Ukraine, the French presidential election is important insofar as it decides who gets to lead Europe's largest military power and second largest economy, and the war in Ukraine has affected the race significantly, so we thought it was worth covering. So let's get into it. When Putin invaded Ukraine in late February, there was quiet speculation that this would actually hurt Macron's prospects. After all, it looked like Macron's diplomatic efforts had failed. Only a few weeks earlier, after a marathon 5-hour meeting, Macron had claimed that he'd received assurances from Putin that Russia wouldn't invade Ukraine. Similarly, his last-minute talks with Putin have apparently failed to dissuade the Russian president from invasion. The two have spoken 11 times in the last month, with their last call on March the 6th. Fortunately for Macron, this isn't how things have panned out. Polling suggested that Macron's already significant lead has significantly increased. At time of writing, Politico's poll aggregator puts Macron at 29% of the first round vote, about 5 percentage points higher than a month ago, and 12 points ahead of second-placed Marine Le Pen. Politico also finds that Macron would beat Le Pen by a remarkable 14 points in the second round. The most recent polling has given Macron an even steeper lead. A poll on Tuesday gave Macron an 18-point lead, which would be the largest in a presidential election since 1965. A separate poll from IFOP on March the 3rd found that Macron's net approval rating had jumped 22 points, from -18 to +4. For context, you'd have to go back to Jacques Chirac to find another president who had a positive approval rating at this point in their presidency. This bodes well for Macron. Chirac was re-elected in 2002, overwhelming Jean-Marie Le Pen in the second round with a ridiculous 82% of the vote, the biggest landslide in French presidential history. Anyway, you get the point. Macron has had a good war. So why is this? Well, it's both because the war's helped Macron, but also because the war has seriously hurt many of his challenges. Let's start with how the war has benefited Macron. For starters, wars usually benefit incumbents. Politicians get a chance to lead and look statesmanlike. But the war in Ukraine especially benefits Macron for a couple of reasons. First, foreign policy is one of Macron's strengths. He's clearly a big picture guy, more comfortable talking about European strategic economy than domestic stuff like gas prices or unemployment. Second, with Merkel gone, Macron has emerged as the leader of Europe. Putin talked to Macron more than any other European leader, and Macron is the only European politician who's still in touch with the Russian president. Third, the war validates Macron's argument that Europe needs to take its own security more seriously. For the last few years, Macron has been talking non-stop about what he terms European strategic autonomy. Essentially, Macron has been arguing that, as the US pivots to Asia, Europe can no longer rely on its allies across the Atlantic for security guarantees. Macron famously described NATO as brain dead back in 2019, and has been arguing that the European Union should take a more active role in European security. Now, while Macron was wrong in part, NATO is clearly no longer brain dead, and Biden has proved a relatively keen Atlanticist, his basic premise that Europe needs to take its own security more seriously now looks remarkably prescient. Other European states apparently agree. Defence spending is going up across the board, and Germany has agreed to literally triple its military investments. The EU is even sending military support to Ukraine, and was originally planning on sending fighter jets from EU soil. Anyway, you get the point. The war in Ukraine has helped Macron in that he's been proved mostly correct about the European strategic autonomy, and has emerged as the de facto leader of Europe. As we mentioned earlier though, the war has also hurt some of the other candidates. Marine Le Pen, for example, used to be a big Putin fan. She publicly supported Russia's annexation of Crimea after receiving a €9 million loan from a small bank, First Czech Russian Bank, with links to the Kremlin, and met Putin in the run-up to the 2017 presidential election. Le Pen has scrambled to distance herself from Putin, admitting the war has, quote, partially changed her view of the Russian president, and ordering campaigners to destroy over 1 million pamphlets featuring a photo of her shaking hands with Putin. Zemmour is in a similarly tough spot. In 2019, he said he dreamt of a French Putin, and called his concerns around NATO expansionism in Ukraine and Georgia completely legitimate. Immediately after the invasion, Zemmour argued that the West is in fact responsible and that France should not welcome Ukrainians fleeing the conflict because they should stay in Poland. After his poll numbers dropped a couple of percentage points, Zemmour quickly changed tack, saying on Thursday that he condemned Russia's unjustifiable invasion without reservations. Both Le Pen and Zemmour had previously made confident predictions that Russia wouldn't invade. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the emerging frontrunner of the French left, has also struggled. Mélenchon has long called for French withdrawal from NATO and previously blamed the Ukraine crisis on American imperialism. In 2015, Mélenchon implied that Ukraine should break up and described the annexation of Crimea as legitimate. Since the invasion, Mélenchon has repositioned himself as an anti-war pacifist, opposing the war but also any arms deliveries to Ukraine. Mélenchon has also continued to argue for French withdrawal from NATO. Pécresse is probably the only candidate who hasn't had to reposition, but she's been unable to successfully attack Macron, and her campaign has continued to do poorly. Pécresse's poll ratings have dropped from 17% to about 12% today. That poll we mentioned earlier puts her in 5th place with just 10%. A month ago, she was performing the best of all candidates in head-to-head polling against Macron, with some polls finding her and Macron level at 50-50. Today, Politico's poll of polls aggregator suggests that Pécresse would lose the second round by a massive 22 points. You get the point, Macron now looks almost certain to win. The Economist's French election model now gives Macron a 95% chance of winning the presidency, with Le Pen in second place at just 4%. So, could this change? Well, it's possible. As the election date nears, Macron will have to spend more time focusing on French politics and give up his de facto role as leader of Europe, which might affect his poll ratings. A European cost of living crisis also looks likely. Inflation is running hot, energy costs are high, and the Russians are threatening to cut off gas to Europe. It's possible that this could spark domestic upset, in the same vein as the Gilets jaunes, which marked a low point in Macron's popularity. Although it's worth noting that so far the French government has been able to insulate consumers against the worst of the energy crisis. EDF, which is majority owned by the French state, limited energy price rises to just 4% this year, well below the rest of Europe. Ultimately, French voters will be unlikely to switch in the middle of a war on the European continent. And if the war is somehow over by April, which looks unlikely, Macron will have played an instrumental role in any negotiations. As things stand then, Macron's re-election is looking very likely. A lot of stats go into videos like this one, and if that kind of stuff normally goes over your head, then you should check out Brilliant.
Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform which turns complex subjects into fun and interactive experiences. You might not expect this, but I actually did a computer science degree, and jumping into Brilliant to refresh my skills was incredibly exciting and engaging. But you don't need that kind of background. If you just want to spend a bit of time building your programming skills, then you can do it right away, with no long boring lectures like I had to sit through. Sorry to my former university. But instead, you can learn through interactive games and puzzles. There's something at all levels too, with more advanced courses on things like neural networks or even quantum computing. And it's not just computer science either. Brilliant has loads of interactive STEM courses that you can get hands-on with. Just pick a course you're interested in and get started. And don't worry, they're all designed by award-winning instructors and built on the principle of active learning. So you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. Essentially then, Brilliant helps you learn new things and sharpen your skills. So if you want to improve with STEM, then sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDREU. And the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off the annual premium subscription.